This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet by Matthew T. Huber. The climate crisis is a class problem rooted in who owns, controls, and profits from material production. As such, it will take a class struggle to solve. In this groundbreaking analysis, Matt Huber argues that the carbon-intensive capitalist class must be confronted for producing climate change. The narrow and unpopular roots of climate politics in the professional class is not capable of building a movement to face this challenge. For an alternative strategy, he proposes climate politics that will appeal to the vast majority of society, the working class. Huber evaluates the Green New Deal as a first attempt to channel working-class material and ecological interests, and advocates building union power in the very energy system we so need to transform. In the end, as in classical socialist movements of the early 20th century, winning the climate struggle will require an internationalist approach based on a form of planetary working-class solidarity. Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet by Matthew T. Huber, out now from Verso Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. The capitalist world system is ordered from its political economic centers, but its structure and dynamics have above all else been analyzed, exposed, and to a certain extent transformed from the periphery, particularly from Latin America. This interview is about the United Nations CEPAL, La Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe, or in English, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. CEPAL is the institution that, after World War II, gathered economists from across Latin America in Santiago, Chile, where they developed the conceptual framework for understanding the world economy as a set of unequally structured relationships between primary commodity exporting nations on the periphery and finished goods manufacturers in the global center. The primary commodity exporting periphery faced a structural problem of declining terms of trade with the industrialized center. In other words, the relative price of the primary goods that Latin America exported, like sugar or coffee, were declining over time relative to the price of the machinery that Latin America needed to import from the wealthy center in order to industrialize and diversify their peripheral economies away from just exporting those primary goods. The challenge was to overcome the development paradox. The periphery needed more trade and aid, CEPALinos believed, to overcome their long-term dependence on trade and aid. The capitalist global economy has undergone profound transformations since Argentine economist Raúl Prebisch took over CEPAL in 1949. But the foundational insights of CEPALinos, which would later pave the way for more radical and Marxist dependentistas and their dependency theories, and also for world systems theory, remain critical today for understanding the power relationships that continue to pervade the global economy. Since England's capitalist takeoff and the rise of the capitalist world system, each new contending developmental state, from successes in Germany and Japan, or more recently, South Korea and China, to the continually frustrated efforts across today's global South, each country has been forced to contend with a constantly transforming world system that is premised on protecting incumbents in the center and dominating the periphery. Even as, meanwhile, the contradictions of that process for the global center have accelerated. My guest today is historian Margarita Fajardo, and we're discussing her book, The World That Latin America Created, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America in the Development Era. In it, Fajardo tells the story of CEPAL and the multiple projects of CEPALinos from its founding through its early battles with the IMF over the causes and solutions to inflation, the polarization over the U.S.'s reformist Alliance for Progress, and Cuba's revolutionary break, the flight from the Brazilian dictatorship to Allende's democratic road to socialism in Chile, and then Pinochet's fascist coup, all the way through the rise of dependency theory and then of world systems theory. It's a remarkable story. I don't think you will hear an interview like this tracing the history of Latin American economic thought in such depth with such a brilliant guest on too many other podcasts. My point here is not to brag, though it is bragging, but it is to remind you why you listen to The Dig, so you are more receptive to my request for financial support, which I'm making right now. If you love The Dig, please support us at patreon.com/TheDig. We have lots of goodies to send you to thank you for your support, including our weekly newsletter sent to you by email in exchange for a monthly contribution of any amount at all, even $1. We get new supporters every day. We also lose supporters every day because people lose their job and because they, God forbid, stop listening to podcasts for some reason, or because they suddenly become revolutionary Marxist-Leninists who have no time for Jacobin's reformist Sochdem charade. Anyhow, we need your support to keep making this happen. Please contribute what you can at patreon.com/TheDig. That's patreon.com/TheDig. Okay, here's Margarita Fajardo, a historian at Sarah Lawrence College and the author of The World That Latin America Created, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America in the Development Era. Margarita Fajardo, welcome to The Dig.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me and having me here. Very excited.
There were two fundamental initial insights that shaped CEPAL, and they were first developed by its longtime leader, Argentine economist Raúl Prebisch. And we'll discuss this a lot later, it would go on to do a lot to shape dependency theory and world systems theory. So the first insight was that the global economy was divided between center and periphery. And then second, that these primary commodity exporting economies on the periphery, that they faced a structural problem of declining terms of trade with the industrialized center of the world economy. Explain these two interrelated insights. What constituted the center and the periphery, and what about that relationship within the global economy structured those declining terms of trade?
The center and periphery refers exactly to that inequality, and it refers to an inequality that springs from the international division of labor, one in which the peripheries are producing commodities or raw materials and agricultural products, mining products for the world's industrial centers, who in turn are producing sort of manufactures and capital goods that the periphery buys. So this specialization in this sort of, on the one hand, on raw materials and on the other on manufacturers is what creates this, is what the idea of center periphery tries to capture. And the problem is that at some point, what this relationship, or rather this sort of the relationship between center and periphery became an obstacle for economic development, because the prices of those primary products or those commodities were in the long term falling in relation to the prices of manufactured goods. And what this meant was that there was it means two things, I guess. It has implications sort of like a theoretical level, and it has implications at a practical level. At a theoretical level, it meant that sort of the ideas of the advantages of a specialization in international trade were coming into question, some of those very principles of 19th century liberalism. And on a practical level, it meant that the countries that specialize in these products, which are in Latin America or Africa and Asia sometimes as well, won't be able to sort of catch up, or their income is not going to be able to catch up with the rest. So those are the kind of fundamental kind of questions there. I would leave it at that for now, but we can certainly talk more at that.
The concepts of center and periphery, when we hear them today, sound very Marxist. And Marxists would certainly come to embrace them later on. But at the time of CEPAL's founding, or when Prebisch took over, he had developed these ideas while working for the Sociedad Rural Argentina, the association of the country's largest agricultural exporters, not exactly a bastion of revolutionary politics. And also while he served as central banker under the authoritarian government that was later overthrown by Perón. Meanwhile, you write that in Latin America at the time that Marxists were more interested in studying the feudal structure of the region's domestic economies and political structures. Where did Prebisch fit into economics and intelligentsia at the time, particularly in Latin America? What was he drawing on to develop his analysis?
Well, let me first back a little bit to Prebisch's kind of position in a way, because he, as you clearly say, he's a policymaker in a way. He's a economist in practice. Even though he's a professor, he's really not an academic. So his circle is really those of, like, he's embedded in solving very, in a way, practical problems of the economic policymaker. And the first time he used the notions of center and periphery words with regards with money flows and how the money flow in and out of the periphery during kind of this capitalist cycles, and so it was in this very sort of constrained concept that, as you say, clearly has nothing to do with Marxism. But there's some literature that talks about this kind of early context of Prebisch and how some ideas that he was circulated within the circles that he had, and he could have been exposed, let's say, to kind of some of the terms or the ideas, if not necessarily had any ideological influence on him, I think. And that is sort of the kind of major disconnect that in many ways it was only going to be like in the 1960s and early 1970s, I guess, with dependency theory, that some of these ideas are going to connect explicitly with Marxism. And even so, like the debates about whether dependency theory is or is not Marxist inspired or is not within the Marxist canon, if you will, started very early on and persist, I guess, to this day.
Cepalinos believed that the solution to this entrenched structural disadvantage for peripheral economies was to be found in a combination of trade and aid with the center, which you write amounted to, quote, the periphery's development paradox, the need for more trade and aid, notwithstanding the long-term dependence on trade and aid. How did Cepalinos see trade with the center as resolving problems caused by trade with the center? And then what role did aid play in that vision for breaking out of the development paradox?
I think this is to me it's a very interesting and something that sometimes sort of escapes us about third world or global south development experts and development statesmen and others who are interested in kind of conceptualizing what development is. And it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of, they're not economic nationalists or seeking for like autarky, but rather as kind of many of these proposals that Cepalinos put forward, it has to do with kind of better terms. I mean, literally better terms of trade, like in this sort of sense, but like better organization of international trade. So it serves the interest of these nations. So as to what was the role of trade and aid in the development paradox? So first, what is the development paradox? And I think one of the defining feature of the development paradox, or the way I try to explain it briefly, is that Cepalinos saw that industrialization in the long term was gonna be able to shield the economies from the vulnerabilities of trade and was gonna be able to transform the relation between center and peripheries that they envisioned, and by so doing was going to transform the global economy. But in the meantime, like in the short term, industrialization required larger and larger amounts of foreign exchange as more kind of more expensive goods needed to be imported to keep up that industrialization. Think about technology or think about machines that there are more sophisticated machines or equipment that is needed to produce more sophisticated goods. Like if you start from like paper or beer or bottled beer, right? Like, or any of these two kind of moving to producing cars, capital goods will require a lot more foreign exchange, and therefore you need even more trade to get those foreign proceeds to continue with the industrialization process.
This is a basic problem with moving up the value chain. To make and sell the stuff that will make you more money, you need to buy expensive stuff.
Exactly. So that was the problem that they were confronting, and hence why it's sort of a paradox. What's going to help you solve your problem deepens sort of the issue that you're trying to solve. And I think they thought that trade agreements, like commodity trade agreements or price stabilization mechanisms or aid, is a mechanism to compensate for this, to kind of fill that gap of the ever increasing need for imports with an ever decreasing value of exports in total, right? Not just in prices, but also in volume. So yes, that's what they thought of it, like this compensatory mechanism that was going to be able to kind of solve in some ways the development paradox.
Yeah, and ultimately solving the development paradox would require some form of cooperation from the first world or center.
Yeah, I mean, that is the basic premise of their project. And that is something, I guess, that dependentistas are later going to criticize them about, precisely believing that the world economic order in the post-war era was built on the assumption that there was going to be international cooperation and that there was going to be some respect for national autonomy. And so Cepalinos, in a way, believed in these promises and premises of this order, and that's something that dependentistas are going to later on criticize them for.
CEPAL was established in Chile as a United Nations agency in 1948. How did Latin America go about establishing such a regionally specific body within the UN? What perceived need was it responding to within this brand new international political institution? And then lastly, why did the great powers go along with it?
So I think that Latin American representatives kind of saw a space opening up where there was none, let's say. So there were commissions or regional commissions established for war-torn regions like Europe and Asia. And it was sort of justified to kind of veer off from the UN internationalism discourse and practice to kind of adopt regional organizations within the institution because of it was like an emergency, right? Because of the urgent needs of reconstruction. And then I think at that moment, Chilean diplomat who had the idea of CEPAL kind of saw an opening there and saying like, well, this could be the institutional precedent, if you will, to advocate for a similar organization for Latin America. And so they requested an organization for Latin America based on the premise that Latin America had economic difficulties created by the war, and that it had also participated in the war effort by, in a way, giving cheap products of key commodities for the war. And the interesting thing to me also is that CEPAL, unlike the other commissions, kind of acquired a life of its own and an importance that the other ones didn't. And this, we can maybe talk about it more, or why, and the role that other Cepalinos have to do with this sort of transformation of the institutions and becoming it and enlarging the scope, that the very limited scope that it was supposed to have. And so to go back to your question of how does it fit in this sort of general institutional framework that was created after the war, I think, and this is something that I think it's important to talk about, the IMF, when the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were created, they were also supposed to be a third organization, right, on international trade. And this organization sort of never materialized, the International Trade Organization. And I think in many ways, CEPAL started to fill that vacuum. And it became the site sort of the locus for having discussions about the role of international trade in the economic order and in development as well. So I think that's why there was a space that needed to be filled, and kind of CEPAL started to fill that role.
Alongside Chile, CEPAL took root in Brazil, especially beginning with a young economist named Celso Furtado, who had a lot of influence in the developmentalist administration of, and my Portuguese pronunciation is not good, Getulio Vargas, who was the president at the time and a former dictator, which, like Prebisch's work in Argentina under the authoritarian government there, reveals just how broad of an appeal there was for state-led developmentalism across the region. It was not just a left-wing thing. What about that moment in Brazil made it so fruitful for Cepalino ideas to gain so much influence? And then what did Cepalinos accomplish with that influence?
There's two ways to kind of approach that question. I think on the one hand, some of the explanations for the influence of Brazil has to do with kind of the networking and institutional building role of a Cepalino like Celso Furtado. I think he has a lot of responsibility for bringing Cepalino ideas, making them a part of state development institutions, and he himself became a very leading, kind of became a adopted or rather had many leadership roles in policy making that kind of embedded many of the Cepalino ideas into state institutions. So he has a very good role, like in the terms of like he has an active role in creating that influence. But as you say, I mean, I think there was also some demand for this, and I think sometimes what we think is like, well, this is the time of like economic nationalism, and people and the idea around CEPAL is that it acquired a lot of influence because it sort of legitimized a process of industrialization that was ongoing. And I don't think this is not, I mean, I think that's true, but it's only sort of a partial answer. It was not just about industrialization. I think one of the reasons why it acquired influence was because of what we were talking about, of this development paradox. The idea that there was something needed additional to industrialization, that there needed to be cooperation, that there needed to be better trade agreements and aid, sort of appealed to many policymakers. So I think it's both of those things, like not just the idea of industrialization and support, or ideological and sort of intellectual support for industrialization, but also conceptualizing some of the very day-to-day struggles of the short term. Because I guess it's something that sometimes we also think of Cepalinos as sort of in bringing about the long, or talking about the long-term effects of international trade on development, but they were also very preoccupied with the short term, as we will kind of see of their interest in inflation. And they were preoccupied with having enough foreign exchange at the moment to solve that development paradox. So trade and aid, as we mentioned before, were those mechanisms. And I think that resonated with policymakers, not only in Brazil, but especially in Brazil because of the word of Furtado.
You write about this really important economic forum, this Organization of American States, OAS Economic Forum, that takes place in Quintanilha, Brazil in 1954, where Cepalinos won over much of Latin America to this really comprehensive developmentalist proposal that they put forward. It included guaranteed prices and markets for Latin American exports in the center, meaning the United States, economic development planning to industrialize peripheral countries through import substitution industrialization, and then also, critically, new lending criteria for the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the Export-Import Bank. You write, quote, "Whereas international development organizations understood monetary stability as a prerequisite to lending, Cepalinos insisted that lending was necessary for monetary stability." And as I said, CEPAL won over most of the representatives from across Latin America. And yet their proposal was essentially blocked by the U.S. administration of President Dwight Eisenhower. What were the stakes of this meeting in Quintanilha? And why did the U.S. oppose what CEPAL was putting forward? And what were the consequences of the U.S. becoming such an obstacle?
Well, I think the stakes of the conference were to show it was sort of CEPAL's, how would you call it? Like
coming out party.
Coming out party, yeah. In which we see a whole, not just piecemeal suggestions here and there, but a complete, as you were saying, like a complete comprehensive plan. And that's why you sort of call it like a development platform. Like they sort of presented there the development platform, and it was also because it was it was also important because it sort of showed the confrontation between the OAS and CEPAL. We have to remember that the OAS, the Organization of American States, which acquired that name only the same year that CEPAL was founded, and I think that's not coincidental.
It was the Pan American Union prior to that.
It was the Pan American Union, and it created, it had this Inter-American Economic and Social Council, which when CEPAL was created, some like the American policymakers and some U.S. Representatives of the UN argued that Economic and Social Council made CEPAL irrelevant, basically, that there was no need to create another institution that had an economic mandate for the region because that one already existed. And so the OAS meeting in 1954 in Quitandinha was like the test of this conflict between the OAS and CEPAL. And so what I was trying to show there was like, well, in many ways, as you were saying, like CEPAL sort of won that match at least. And it positioned itself as like, not only like it took over a bit on the organization of the meeting, but also it managed to set the agenda of the discussion. And I don't know if like the impact of the U.S. blocking the initiative. I don't think it was necessarily like a big transformation in the sense that much of that was sort of expected, I think. So it wasn't, there were signs of a kind of change in U.S. policy, that there were sort of leaks and like announcements and sort of that there was an attempt to kind of change the U.S. policy. But I think that it made, so I don't think it was necessarily that transformative.
What was more important, in other words, was that CEPAL really was beginning to win the battle for ideas within Latin America.
I think so. I mean, I think in that sense, that's why the conference was important, regardless the position of the U.S. I mean, this is a battle that was going to keep on going for more decades, right? To kind of try to get the center to cooperate in the ways that, in some way, in the eyes of Cepalinos, it had promised to do when it established itself as a hegemonic power and the center of this kind of new global order. So it was something that they were sort of expecting the U.S. to take the role that it, in a way, aspired to have, I guess.
Well, while CEPAL was waiting for cooperation from the United States to be forthcoming, they first looked to regional cooperation and integration, starting with a project of El Salvador-led economic integration of Central America, and then also this proposed payments union that would solve the problem of these hard currency limits that governments across Latin America faced. But you write that regional integration ran into the, quote, unresolved contradiction of the unequal trade relations between centers and peripheries within particular Latin American countries. And then in terms of the payments union, the proposed payments union, the IMF basically blocked it, insisting that it could do and should do whatever was needed. What promise did regional integration hold for Cepalinos?
The regional integration projects are something that I think deserve a lot more of attention than they have had so far. And I only sort of started digging into them. But I think Cepalinos that's the language that they spoke with when they talked about regional integration, was about, in a way, taking advantage of economies of scale. Like national markets were too restricted, were too small to kind of make industrialization like this, what we were talking about before, like this getting up in these stages of harder and harder levels of industrialization, to they were too small to kind of make that feasible. And so they believed that regional integration could do that. So for instance, and when they look to Europe and when they look to the US industrialization, a lot of these policymakers remarked that successful countries had some sort of continental wide size. And that, I mean, and if you could, think of the Soviet Union, I guess it applies the same way. And they were also kind of doing efforts for industrialization. So I think that that's the thought that was in their minds, like, well, we need bigger. The size does matter, and we need bigger markets for our products. So I think that was behind the regional integration project.
Also, you write that Latin American countries did not have a lot of trade relations with each other at the time.
Mm-hmm. That was very, so that was very restricted, which is kind of has shifted around a lot, like in the 21st century or by the 21st century. That is not longer true. There's a lot of trade relations within those countries, but it was very true in the mid century. So it was important for them to kind of establish those kind of trade relationships to kind of circumvent the need for hard currency, for instance. Like, so there could be some sort of barter, let's call it barter-like, because it wasn't barter, but like barter-like agreements that could circumvent the need for hard currency, which was the only kind of mechanism that these countries could trade among themselves. So it was, if they could trade with each other without using hard currency, then the hard currency could be saved for future projects of development, that they could, like investment in these machines or larger or more expensive capital goods. So that's definitely something behind the regional integration project as well.
But so at this point in the early years, cooperation from the center isn't forthcoming, and regional integration isn't working either. Are Prebisch and other CEPALinos getting frustrated?
I don't think they necessarily are getting frustrated just yet, but I think in the early 1950s, because they're just starting, I guess. But I think, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think that their whole project starts with frustration. They are seeing that there are many changes that need to happen quite quickly, and they're not. Because remember that at the point where CEPALinos kind of begin their project, a lot of the kind of development path are a lot of the large Latin American countries like Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, are already kind of moving from that easy sort of stage to the difficult stage. And so they start their project with a sense of frustration and urgency that something needs to happen. That's why cooperation is crucial at this moment, because that's when it's needed to give that kind of, to make the leap, right, to this other stage. And that's why they're adamant they insist on it. So I think many of them are frustrated, but in many ways they're also, I mean, they keep working on the same project for decades. So something has to be, like, they're hopeful, I guess, that there's some role for them in transforming these economies.
In the early years, CEPAL worked together with the IMF. And I think that you're right, if I remember correctly, that CEPALinos even initially saw the IMF rather optimistically as a sort of global Keynesian entity. But soon they came into pretty serious conflict, starting with inflation. And CEPALinos articulated a structural account, which identified the roots of inflation as being in these fundamental issues, like the unequal terms of trade, unequal land tenure, while the IMF, in a position that would be very familiar to us today, blamed rising wages for rising prices, and so insisted that austerity through these stabilization plans were the only solution. And in response, CEPALinos accused the IMF of being monetarists. And this is really a remarkable part of your book. They deployed monetarist as a derogatory term well before Milton Friedman and fellow neoliberals became so associated with it. How did this conflict between CEPAL and the IMF over inflation emerge in the 1950s? And what were the political and policy stakes of their differing interpretations?
Well, I think that although the IMF and CEPAL, the conflict between these two organizations has becomes part or is considered kind of an ideological dispute, like a dispute about ideas of where or how does inflation originate, and what are the mechanisms to deal with it, what are the effects, and what is the relationship between inflation and development, inflation and growth. I think we can start, or what I try to show in the book is that the conflict starts before it becomes ideological. It's a question about power and influence. It's a battle of these two institutions that are trying to assert themselves in Latin America. And we have to remember that the IMF took a sidestep position from Europe and European integration, and that very quickly the IMF, like the developing countries, become the most important kind of clients and audience, I guess, for IMF proposals. So
because the IMF feels like it got shut out of Europe, basically, it got outmaneuvered institutionally.
Institutionally, yeah, they didn't have a role in the creation of the payments union. The Marshall Plan came in and sort of made European integration part of a process of bilateral relations with the US rather than an international part of the kind of internationalism that the IMF represented. And so the role, so Latin America becomes an important battleground for these. I mean, for CEPAL because it has a scope, but for the IMF as well. So this battle between CEPAL and the IMF that will have very important they would take an ideological shape, let's say, begins with this battle over influence and what is the appropriate scope for each of these institutions. Can CEPAL make proposals such as the monetary payments union, that they proposed in the mid-1950s, or does that sort of encroach in the territory of the IMF? So these are and of course, within these institutional battles, there is something at stake, and is defining precisely what is the relationship between inflation and growth. And that is something that is going to be come about later on in the debate between CEPAL and the IMF.
Yeah, and ironically, at least initially, Prebisch was himself more of a monetarist, which is in keeping with his more generally small c conservative worldview. I mean, he even, amid these inflation debates, returned to Argentina to work with the military dictatorship that had ousted Perón. What happened during the 1950s to bring this conflict over inflation within CEPAL and between CEPAL and the IMF? What happened to bring it to a head in Chile? And how did that conflict propel CEPAL toward the left, toward the side of an increasingly organized working class, and in a way against the theoretical and political line held by Prebisch?
What was going to become like the Cepalino approach to inflation begins as sort of a split between Cepalinos themselves, and especially between kind of master and disciples. Like, in a way, some of the disciples, if you want to call it, like the Cepalinos, because we should remember that Prebisch was a senior figure with regards to the rest of, in relation to the other Cepalinos by a lot. And he has a kind of leading role. And some of the other Cepalinos start to kind of contest the position that he has taken, and especially those political options that he took by going back again to work for an authoritarian regime in Argentina. And Cepalinos contest that decision and question Prebisch for doing so, and start thinking about maybe there are other ways to explain inflation that not necessarily have to do with the quantity of money, and that actually kind of go back to one of the premises of the Cepalino project that has to do with what is the position of the Latin America or the periphery in general in the international division of labor. Maybe that also plays a role in understanding the kind of long-term inflation that Chile had. And remember, like we should remember that in the 1940s and 50s, Chile had a sustained but not high level inflation, not compare like it's not the levels of the hyperinflation of the 1980s, but it does have a high level that is sustained over time, and it becomes a problem for many reasons, like maintaining the value, and it becomes a problem for the cost of living in the 1950s as well. But so I think it has to do with also the incursion of other experts in the Chilean arena that Cepalinos were also like contesting and saying like, well, how can we be kind of the most important? Can we have our headquarters here, and we are not the ones leading the discussion about inflation? So it also has to do with positioning themselves in the economic policy arena as important actors in defining what inflation is. But I think part of the debates about inflation have to do the what Cepalinos are going to end up coalescing about what the origins of inflation are, have to do with conflict as to what were the origins of inflation. And many Prevish did talk about the what was called like the wage price spiral, or sort of a cost approach to inflation, that in many ways sort of ends up blaming wage rises for the increase of inflation. But I think this was not necessarily like a monetarist understanding. This was more a mainstream understanding, kind of in many ways of Keynesian. That was sort of also the prevalent kind of idea about inflation at the time. And so at the moment that this is the sort of mainstream understanding, that Cepalinos come with other approaches to inflation is sort of interesting. The structural approach to inflation that is going to say, well, there are two things driving inflation. One is a lagging agricultural sector that doesn't produce enough food to feed the population. And then the other one has to do with the impact of the periphery, of being located in the periphery in trade, that there's a lot of volatility coming on in the economy via the exchange rate that generates inflation.
Yeah, and the Cepalino left, advocating this structural approach, really attempts to make the case that the struggle over inflation is a class struggle, an argument with important implications for the U.S. in the 1970s, and one that has, of course, become very relevant in the U.S. today, and as a result of the global power held by the Fed for the entire global economy, particularly the global South.
So yeah, and I think to go back to kind of one of the questions that you stated before, the effect it has over CEPAL as a whole. So in many ways, the structural approach to inflation in the beginning is sort of considered, or they think of it as a kind of a middle ground position in a way, sort of an attempt to kind of be holistic and comprehensive while returning to some of the key Cepalino tenets. But the approach also sort of acquires these, or has these tremendous effects in the late 1950s and early 1960s in Chile, but also in Brazil, that radicalize what the structural approach means. And so as many people start using the ideas first explored by Cepalinos of against stabilization plans, the structural approach to inflation and Cepalinos sort of become very much or start to represent part of a radical, or not necessarily a radical left, but sort of sets them in the political left to some degree, and that is changing very quickly because there are other forces that are pulling them to the right, I guess. It's a moment of a lot of political tensions in Latin America in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and Cepalinos are sort of navigating that very polarized arena, and they are themselves being transformed by it.
Yeah, with this polarizing politics, with an increasingly militant and organized working class, this inflation crisis also polarizes CEPAL, and the left comes out talking about, as you say, first initially the structural approach being a more holistic, moderate approach, but many Cepalinos radicalizing alongside the working classes in these countries to critique the monetarist stabilization plans as in favor of capitalist elites, and the IMF pushing them as essentially an imperialist force in the region.
Right. So, I mean, they could have said taking the path of understanding inflation as a class struggle, and that was something, or as a mechanisms of redistributing income between classes. But that was not necessarily the approach taken, or that was not what became the Cepalino approach to inflation, and yet it was still sort of radicalized and used by others who were taking up that cause, and therefore kind of positioned Cepalinos in these in sometimes in this place that many of them did not feel comfortable with.
Well, and things would only get more uncomfortable for CEPAL, beginning with the Cuban Revolution in particular, which brought renewed polarization, or was both a product of and cause of renewed polarization across Latin America, and also created, in doing so, a new left pole for politics across the region in the 1960s. And the U.S. initially promised to respond not so much through emphasizing the sort of reaction of the 1954 coup in Guatemala, but instead by leading a massive region-wide reform effort, the JFK's Alliance for Progress. You write, quote, "Although ideologically kilometers apart, both the Cuban Revolution and the Alliance for Progress represented for Cepalinos the culmination of their project. But this was also a point at which CEPAL really began to politically fracture between reformists and revolutionaries. First, though, how did such different projects initially speak to or reflect or even grow out of CEPAL's critique?"
In part, it had to do with the center periphery framework, like the idea, because that notion was in a way very powerful and commanding. In a way, it allowed for embryonic idea. So it allowed, or I don't think embryonic is the sense. No, is the word. Like it had a lot of potential in it, I guess. It could be taken in many different directions. And I guess that is something that I was interested in showing with the book, was the extent to which, with one idea that did bring about like economists from different places and different positions, bring them together to create a collective that we can call Cepalinos. It also kind of created paths for different political projects, and so I think that is one of the. It has to do with that possibility and created by the notion of center periphery, because many of them still kept ascribing to it and referring to their projects in that terminology. So I think it helped them understand their project, even if it was going in very different political directions. And to me, like the Alliance for Progress and the Cuban Revolution are just a way to kind of symbolize that divergence and the way that Cepalinos is starting to kind of diverge in this way. And I think what's at stake with both is that they think that both of these projects are going to be able to transform the relation between center and peripheries, like to transform that global inequality, either via cooperation on the one hand or by kind of breaking away from it, like in the Cuban Revolution.
You write that thanks to the dominance of King Sugar, quote, "Cuba represented the quintessential example of the perverse relation between center and periphery that Cepalinos had denounced. And Cepalinos played an early, pretty important role in the revolution. They wrote its economic manifesto and set up the revolutionary government's planning agency. But ultimately, CEPAL split over the revolution, and CEPAL as an institution withdrew as the revolution became explicitly communist, particularly with, one, the implementation of a really radical agrarian reform plan, and then with the purging of non-communist elements. How substantively did CEPAL help shape the revolution's initial trajectory? And then what were the consequences for CEPAL when it broke with the revolution?
Yeah. So one thing that your comment about King Sugar reminded me of is that sometimes, like, the problem of being in the periphery and the problem of Latin American countries was not only that they were producing commodities, but that usually it was one or two commodities, so that they were very exposed to the changes in prices and demand of those commodities. And that's why Cuba sort of exemplifies that to an extreme, because it was one of the ones, like, less diversified. A lot of their economic structure was geared towards the production and commercialization of sugar. So that's why it sort of epitomizes that extreme, like the fact that it's just one or maybe two commodities. And that's so, just to kind of clarify why that is. And so what are how did CEPAL and CEPALinos sort of shape the revolution? There were, to me, this was a kind of one of the other very novel innovations of the book had to do with this participation of CEPALinos in the revolution. We hear a lot about intellectuals' interest in the revolution, but I think I would argue not, as neither of them had these kind of high level roles that CEPALinos did. And even if so I think that's one of the kind of main points first. And how did they shape it? Well, as you said, like, CEPALinos participated. Well, first of all, were part of the one CEPALino and another CEPALino ally were the ones who formulated the kind of economic manifesto of the revolution in its early days and set out what was the revolution trying to do. And a lot of the terms in which it defined the path of the revolution were along the lines of the CEPALino ideas, kind of the transformation of the relation between Cuba and the United States, the reducing the dependence on sugar and industrialization of the promoting industrialization in the island and moving away just from agriculture, etc. The other way which they in this manifesto, this Regino Botti, and kind of imagined a role for CEPAL in the revolution even before the triumph of the revolution. Like, for Botti, CEPAL had effectively kind of helped some countries like Brazil and Chile in bringing about or thinking about ways to development, and he imagined that Cuba could do the same. And so he did, like, invite CEPALinos very early on to participate in Cuba with a mission, like one of sort of like a technical mission that was supposed to train economists in planning techniques. And we should remember that at the very early stages of the Cuban Revolution, many of the sort of kind of middle classes and professionals were escaping the island. And so it was important to kind of train this new generation. And the other one was putting one of the CEPALinos, Regino Botti, as head of the Minister of the Economy for the first 5 years. Of course, we can think about, well, to what extent were the ministers actually making decisions. But to my, as opposed to Castro or Che Guevara or any of the other commanders. And I think that the fact that he stayed and then kind of was asked to leave kind of speaks about the importance that it had in sort of thinking and shaping some of the project. As for the consequences that it had for CEPAL, well, first we have to talk about what happened to CEPAL with the participation on the Cuban Revolution. So at the level, so some CEPALinos, like I was saying, like Regino Botti, participated in the revolution sort of as CEPALinos, but also on their own kind of personal terms. But the institution itself sent a mission to CEPAL and to Cuba, and then kind of aborted earlier than the Cuban government desired. And that was a clearly political based decision by Prebisch that kind of shaped the position that CEPAL was going to take with regards to Cuba, which was a big debate Latin Americans too, how all the governments had, like, and that position changed over time, how to address the Cuba question, let's say. Should they support Cuba's right to self-determination, regardless of whether they agreed or not with the path it was taken, or should they take a stand against a shift towards communism that many of the leaders at the moment were afraid could take over in the rest of the region? So CEPAL was sort of in that similar kind of conundrum, I guess. And the decision taken of Prebisch of taking the CEPALino mission out of Cuba before it had sort of finished and before the Cuban government required it, was interpreted as this sort of sign, this positioning itself against Cuba. So the two sides of this participation are there, right? Like this kind of devotion to the Cuban Revolution by Cepalinos like Botti, but also the institutional withdrawal, and that made it clear for many on the intellectual left that CEPAL had sort of changed, and it was no longer representing this sort of voice of the periphery and this attempt to address global inequality, but sort of had a necessarily not taken its ideals to the fullest extent possible, or at least that was interpreted by the intellectual left.
But really, looking back, in a sense, it was the politics of the periphery which were understandably, given the conditions, radicalizing, and Prebisch, who was more staying the same.
Probably, yeah. That is also the case, and I think what we were talking about with the structural approach to inflation was that some Cepalinos were being sort of radicalized, but they were also radicalizing the debate, like by presenting their ideas and how their ideas were understood in this context of polarization, also helped kind of radicalize the debate. So both of the things were happening, and they're happening simultaneously, right? Like all the participation on the Cuban Revolution simultaneous with the participation in the Alliance for Progress and with the conflict with the IMF as well, in like the peak of the conflict of the IMF. So one can imagine that all these things happening at the same time, like it's CEPAL being pulled in all these very different directions, and without a clear resolution, let's say.
In 1961, President John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress was wholeheartedly embraced by Prebisch and also by Celso Furtado in Brazil and other Cepalinos. It was a reformist response to the Cuban Revolution, and it was really ostensibly firmly on Cepalino grounds. It was this cooperation from the center, it appeared, that CEPAL had been waiting for and that their theory kind of depended on. And it drew on Prebisch's proposals. JFK met with Prebisch, requested that CEPAL take the lead in working with the OAS to help each country make their development plan. But all of that was complicated very quickly. First, the Bay of Pigs invasion happens just like a month after the Alliance for Progress was announced, which scandalizes Latin American governments really across the political spectrum. And then Prebisch, along with Furtado in Brazil, they were both really sidelined, and the Alliance's Promise program was never concretely implemented. How did this gap between the Alliance for Progress's lofty stated ambitions and its dismal reality, how did that gap emerge? And then how did the Alliance's failure and, more generally, this increasingly intense opposition between the revolutionary and counter-revolutionary projects impact CEPAL's thinking and political orientation?
Yeah. So first, to kind of the idea of Alliance for Progress failure, I've had like a lot of discussions too about this with others about the extent to which it can, I mean, to me, to which we can say it failed, at least very early on. And I think for Cepalinos at least, and for many who were there, although the alliance kind of ended up inspiring many projects, and this is true of many like housing projects, for instance, in Chile, but also in Colombia, in other countries, to, as you say, the contrast between what it could do and what it hoped to do was the fact that the gap was very clear from early on, despite that some of these projects were, carried on and with the Alliance for Progress funding. So I think that one of the reasons what the Alliance for Progress failed is, I guess, one of the what can be kind of stated in some of the words of Furtado, that it was very clearly a political tool. And so the economic effects that it would have were being kind of derailed or not prioritized as much. And so I think people started losing faith very quickly because it was clearly a response to the revolution. And although many people, I mean, that's the sort of thing in that we have it sort of like in at this moment, there are many people support the revolution, but there are many others who are like worried of the consequences of having that revolution in the region. So even though this happened, I think they even though by the support, those who had supported the Alliance for Progress were themselves are kind of quickly disappointed because the ambitions didn't translate into practice for many reasons. Some have to do with, like, I guess, bureaucracy and the uh, how to unfold these plans. Like, do the countries have the plans they're required? Is there political will to make them happen? And also because it was clearly, as I was saying, that it was a form of influencing domestic policies, and so people, many of those involved got pulled away.
Yeah, you write about how in Brazil that the U.S. dedicated Alliance for Progress funds towards really superficial short-term projects that were mostly geared towards being tools for pro-U.S. propaganda rather than solving the development paradox, which is what JFK promised would happen. And you also write that Furtado in Brazil, like Prebisch, that they were both quickly sidelined. And making matters even worse, the U.S. failed to provide much needed aid to President João Goulart, forcing him into this untenable situation of choosing between high inflation and a regressive financial stabilization program that was infuriating the left and militant workers. And in doing so, that the U.S. laid the groundwork for the military coup, the 1964 military coup that overthrew Goulart. And Goulart was initially seen by the U.S. as a democratic alternative to Cuba. But then the U.S. not only abandoned him financially, but also directly supported his overthrow by the Brazilian military. What happened to JFK's insight that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly, like, why did the Alliance for Progress kind of failed. I guess it goes back to your question of, like, why the Alliance for Progress failed that way. And I think, I mean, I don't have any more answer than the one I was just saying before. I think they what Furtado said, like, well, the alliance has become more about the alliance than about progress, is behind that sort of failure. That it's clearly a tool of foreign policy and a political tool, and therefore all the other kind of ideals are sort of lost to it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it not only failed to substantively assist Latin American countries like Brazil in developing along Cepalino lines, it also failed to meet the stated kind of realpolitik geopolitical ambitions of the Alliance for Progress for the U.S., which was precisely to support presidents like Goulart in Brazil as a democratic alternative to revolutionary Cuba. Instead, the U.S. just decided to side with, military dictatorship and reaction.
And the case of Goulart, I think Goulart was also I think it also had to do with Goulart himself, too. He was navigating a very difficult path where things were changing very quickly. And the choices he had made sort of were influencing also the US. Like, the US did provide some funding for the Goulart government early on, but then it didn't continue at the crucial moment when they needed, when Furtado got in charge of the Plano Trienal and solving sort of both the development paradox and the inflation problem. It also kind of failed there in Brazil. But some people could say, like, that in many ways it sort of hold the ground for Chile for a while, kind of supporting those kind of reformers like Frey, and it couldn't sort of prevent. And in any case, like, I think some of the what Furtado would say against the Alliance for Progress is that a lot of it is actually deepening the anti-Americanism and deepening the resentment against the U.S. for its lack of support for development. So it was counterproductive in all these ways that we've talked about.
You write that CEPAL really lost its sense of direction and some of its legitimacy amid what you call the, quote, twin fiascos of their relationship to the Alliance for Progress and then also the Cuban Revolution. And that it was this context that really helped facilitate the rise of dependency theory. Quote, the organization's once radical ideas had become orthodoxy. Dependency theory was developed in Brazil in the years leading up to the 1964 coup, and it was developed in two distinct circles of intellectuals. First, the Paulistas in Sao Paulo, which included, strangely enough, and was really led by, strangely enough, future neoliberal president Fernando Henrique Cardoso. And then there was the Brasilia group, which included the now long since famous German scholar Andre Gunder Frank. Dependentistas took CEPAL's conception of center and periphery as a basic starting point, but they rejected the notion that the development paradox was really a paradox at all. Development, they wrote, could accompany dependency, or it could even underdevelop the periphery. Why did this happen in Brazil? And what were the differences between these two groups and in terms of the version of dependency theory they articulated?
Yeah, I think the dependency theory or dependentistas as a group started to that emerge in Brazil has to do also speak of the influence of Cepalinos in Brazil. This is where their ideas were framing and shaping many of the debates about development, even though these yet to become dependentistas, because I sort of try to trace a difference between the thinkers that were thinking about had dependency ideas. I think that's the word I use in Brazil, versus when dependency coalesces as a theory and more so as a movement in Chile. So I think that's one of the reasons, sort of the influence of dependency in Brazil, with and many of them were reacting to Furtado and his ideas about development. And so I think that has to do with it. And the two different intellectual circles that are not, they are in contact with each other. They're not wholly independent. And so that's why there are many points of contact and also of contestation, because they're with each other. I think kind of represent two different kind of, in a way, intellectual or academic projects. Like Sao Paulo was this sort of, is the site of the industrial production of industrialization in Brazil. Is the site, but also is the site of modernist architecture and art in Brazil, whereas kind of Brasilia sort of represents this sort of future, these kind of possibilities, rethinking or reconceptualizing these Brazil as a nation, right? That was the sort of plan of Brasilia since its formation, to kind of reconceptualize the space and the territory of Brazil as a nation, and shift it away from the centers of power that had been located on the northeast, where Sao Paulo, southeast, where Sao Paulo is located. So I think these two intellectual circles sort of represent that, and the ideas that are going to come from those very specific localities that say are serve to explain the future trajectories that are going to shape the dependency theory and the different strands within them, because they come from these very kind of different positions within Brazil itself, and those positions are gonna shape the different strands that will develop over time in the next throughout the 1960s and in the early 70s.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com, and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. Join the Verso Book Club and get every new ebook that Verso publishes each month, as well as 1 to 3 books in the mail if you choose a print subscription. All Verso Book Club members also get 50% off everything on the website for as long as you're a subscriber. Your support ensures that Verso can continue publishing radical texts, especially costly translation projects. Some upcoming books included in the book club include Abolition Geography, Essays Towards Liberation by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Climate Change's Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet by Matthew T. Huber, Internet for the People, The Fight for Our Digital Future by Ben Tarnoff, and Bad Gays, A Homosexual History by Hugh LeMay and Ben Miller. Cardozo argued that Cepalinos had failed, quote, to even pose the question of how and why the Brazilian entrepreneurs in a country inserted in the global economy as producer of raw materials and primary products would strive for national autonomy. This is something that became later on particularly salient after segments of Brazil's national bourgeoisie played a critical role in the 1964 coup. This naive assessment of the national bourgeoisie's interests, according to the dependentistas, meant that Cepalinos had also generally failed to consider the periphery's domestic political and economic dynamics, including who owned and controlled the means of production. And thus, the Cepalinos ignored, according to the dependentistas, ignored the possibility that dependency could deepen alongside development, which was indeed what appeared to be happening. What had led earlier Cepalinos to take such an optimistic view of the national bourgeoisie? And what was dependency theory's core critique of the role that CEPAL had assigned to the national bourgeoisie?
I think it has to do with their way of conceptualizing the space of development. And it was framed in terms of the nation, right? And the international, the relations between nations. So I think part of it is that's where the sort of vision of the role of the bourgeoisie as a leader of as the leading kind of class, I guess, in the process of development, and also of their whole vision of where does development happen, right? It's in the space of the nation or the international, rather than what dependentistas are going to think about, and it's sort of the transnational role of capital, right? Something that they are going to emphasize as well, like these links across nations of capital that unite them all. And I think, part of the critique of, or part of this optimism on their belief on the power of the national bourgeoisie, that also has to do with an implicit sort of lack of, a lack of understanding of, or a lack of attention, because I don't think it's was a problem of understanding, but mostly lack of attention to the internal structures of power and the class relations that are emerging. Like, in some ways, they believed, I think, that the state could act as the arbiter and embodiment of these different classes and interests, and that their role as experts was to guide the state in that process. So I guess it has to do with, to kind of sum up, like, to the view of the nation and the international as the space of development, and this sort of conceptualization of the state as arbiter and like as of society, I guess, and of the different class interests that are as able to kind of guide the bourgeoisie in the way that they consider possible.
Günter Frank argued that CEPAL misdiagnosed the problem of development as originating in the 19th century's international division of labor. Instead, he contended that it all began well before, with Spanish conquest and Portuguese conquest. Why? And what was at stake in this debate over when the problem started, over the historical origins of this unequal systemic dynamic between center and periphery?
This is like, the question of the studies of, or like of the history of capitalism in Latin America, and I guess in global history as well. What are the origins of capitalism, and what defines those origins? What element are you using to identify what the origin is? And so I think that was part of the critique of Günter Frank, or that was what, it was part of the critique of Günter Frank against Cepalinos, to say that they were looking for the origins of this inequality between center and periphery in the in sort of a crisis or some form of deviation of a norm on capitalist development that was supposed to provide benefits for all the participants of trade. And he was trying to say, like, well, the origin of the problem has to do with of the unequal relation between centers and peripheries is pretty much embedded on capitalism itself, which to him, and there's of course like tons of debate about this kind of Eurocentric position with the creation of a Euro-centered world economy in the early modern era, of which Latin America was part. But I think some scholars also kind of are starting to think like, well, one can hardly say that Latin America was peripheral, in the early modern era. If you think about that, it was the center of what scholars called silver capitalism, right? The era of silver capitalism. So it was, it was also the beginning of producing, it was the production of raw materials as the mechanism to insert itself in the global economy, but it was also vital rather than peripheral for the functioning of that world economy. So there are many debates embedded in sort of the critique of Gunther Frank, and many the ones that kind of intersected with it, such as the one about whether Latin America was feudalist or capitalist in the colonial era, whether some of the legacies that or the obstacles about development were about sort of legacies of that feudal mode of production, if you will, or it had to do with kind of more structural, systemic problems like Cepalinos were sort of proposing. And there's like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like there could be many ways to unpack this question, because that point touches upon many of the debates about what capitalism means in Latin America, what Latin America means for global capitalism.
These decades of revolution and reaction sent dependency theorists, dependentistas and Cepalinos on the move into this really fervent Latin American intellectual diaspora. And the most important thing was Brazilian dependency theorists moving to Chile after the 1964 coup in Brazil. You write, quote, "It was the migration of dependency ideas from Brazil to Chile at a moment in which the military forces ousted the president in the former and the forces of the left envisioned a transition to socialism in the latter that turned dependency theory into a radical political movement in Latin America and the world." How did dependency theory's exile from Brazil, particularly its movement of its headquarters really to Chile, impact dependency theory, and then also, of course, expand its appeal and resonance, both in Chile, which was undergoing a revolutionary democratic road to socialism under Allende, and then also just everywhere across the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think the transition to Chile was key in two levels. One, because it reunited the Brazilian, and now sort of calling them the Brazilian dependentistas, and and this reunification sort of meant that the different ideas that they were toying with became understood as one whole thing that one could call dependency theory, even though many of them sort of contested that understanding of one sort of unified theory or more, or that they were all part of the same thing, later on, the same project. And the second is that this movement in Chile, in this the social sciences were very politicized, made that the Brazilians sort of had to fit or find a space and fit into these into this political landscape and align themselves with many of the projects that were fighting for position. So that kind of mapping of the dependency groups in these different institutions, these different academic institutions, which they themselves had a political affiliation, kind of created politicization of dependency theory, and many of them were actually kind of moving farther and farther to the left. So I think that was part of what radicalized the dependentistas, and what also made it had its impact in the rest of the world. Like as the dependentistas sort of moved from Brazil to Chile for one coup and therefore gathered together, then Chilean military coup is then going to spread not just dependentistas, but many of the social scientists who were sort of, let's say, trained or who had grown with these ideas are now going to spread all over the world. And simultaneously, a lot of social scientists and intellectuals around the world are increasingly paying attention to what's happening in Chile because of that, like because of Allende, and then very quickly, right, because of the coup. So these sort of changes in the political landscape are the ones who are explaining the interest and the influence of dependency ideas in the region and in the rest of the world.
Gunther Frank's article, The Development of Underdevelopment, was widely translated, and it really became the global reference point for dependency theory. And that, you write, annoyed many Latin American dependentistas. To what extent was this a legitimate critique of a Latin American theory becoming known so overwhelmingly through the work of an outsider? And to what degree was it more a pretext for a more political critique coming from Frank's right, particularly from Cardoso?
Yeah, I think I think both of those are true and coexist, right? Like in the on the one hand, it was true, and I was just thinking about that a few days ago, of like this database that I constructed to sort of trace the citations of Cardoso and Frank, and it took me like, forever to kind of make this happen. And it was true that many of the, like, that Frank was overwhelmingly the dependentista that was being more referenced to. But I think it also led for others to seek for other dependentistas. So I don't, maybe it took time, right? Like in the first, I don't know, I would say first decade or so, Frank was definitely the one that was becoming was the reference point. But then as others sort of kind of discovered where this was coming from, other dependentistas in Latin America were also kind of being cited and quoted. And I think it's something that I talk in the book. It has to do with the politics of this sort of, it's not like a, not anything like today of our, reference citation metrics world at all. But there was a transition, I think, very much driven by the political landscape of when does the sort of Frank's version of dependency that prevails over Cardoso's version of dependency, and therefore when each of them complains that the other one is taking a more of a space. I mean, I don't think necessarily that Gunther Frank did that as much as Cardoso did, sort of like claiming that there were, and it was like never named, that there were others who were being interpreters and like translators of an experiment. So I think that when sort of revolution seemed to be possibility, there was complaints, or there was concern that it was Gunther Frank who was representing what Latin American ideas were. And when sort of revolution sort of faded out of as a possibility in the political landscape later on in the 70s and 80s, I think sort of Cardoso's version of dependency theory acquired more attention and saliency. But I honestly think that a lot of these things have to do with like these individuals themselves going through all these changes and trying to position themselves in the academic world, let's say it, and in the political world. So both of those things that you said are true. Like in ways, some ways like petty complaints, I guess. And on the other hand, it had to do with actual transformations, how things were read and how things were translated. I think Gunther Frank, for all of the critiques that he has had, and I do the same in a way for this oversimplification of ideas and overdetermination of historical outcomes, I think those were valid critiques of Frank's ideas. In many ways, help other intellectuals from Latin America to be known, because he had a more extensive network. He was more prolific. He was in contact with so many kind of academic centers around the world that probably the others didn't have that as big of a reach, even though many of them were connected with other academic centers, their network was not as extensive as that of Gunder Franks, and obviously the fact that he was written in English was easier, was another factor contributing to that too.
And critically, should mention that Gunder Frank's work, it was Gunder Frank's work that inspired the most popular dependentista text of all, Eduardo Galeano's classic Venas Abiertas de América Latina, Open Veins of Latin America, which was read by youthful Latin American revolutionaries everywhere.
Yeah, and continues to be read. I think many people that's their entry book into, or their book of entry towards Latin America continues to be Open Veins. So yeah, and he's
including here in the United States.
Very much here in the United States, yeah. That's one of the key works of diffusion of dependency theory, I guess. It's Open Veins, for sure.
Prebisch ultimately left CEPAL to lead the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, not long after it was created in 1964. And for him, you write that it was, quote, in many ways his response to the burgeoning dependency theory. What was UNCTAD created to do, and in what sense was it a response to dependency theory?
I think, well, UNCTAD was sort of created to address some of the problems that international trade created on development, and how to solve some of these problems for all the peripheries of the world. So it was, I guess, unique in that it wasn't the first time, but it was certainly the most important one till that moment, of bringing together all the sort of peripheries of the world, right? Like Asia, Africa, and Latin America, kind of to discuss these issues of international trade, even though, I mean, these peripheries were in many cases kind of competing against each other in the market, I guess. Like they were competitors in the market for some of these products. So it was, hard, I guess, to bring this together, not just for political reasons, but also for economic reasons as well. I do think that this is Prebisch's sort of like response, even though these dependency ideas are sort of growing simultaneously as UNCTAD is progressing, because Prebisch, it was the mechanism that Prebisch used to kind of take the repertoire, sort of what we talked earlier on about CEPAL's development platform, to the global level. So many of what inspired UNCTAD had to do with those commodity agreements, with having quotas for certain products, with reducing the protectionism of the center towards the periphery, right? Like with opening the markets, with having some sort of buffer stocks to avoid the fluctuations in trade, to provide money for balance of payments problems, like all these issues that CEPAL had talked about in the early 1950s with the development platform were then carried over by Prebisch to UNCTAD. And the reason why I think it's a response is because it's his way of saying these ideas are valid and can do more than we in CEPAL have been able to do, at a moment that CEPAL is very much criticized for its lack of kind of understanding at what the problem of development was, and therefore the lack of results that its ideas have produced. So to the loss, like UNCTAD is sort of this response to the loss of legitimacy of CEPAL among the intellectual left, or I guess that's how Prebisch sees it. Prebisch sees, like, there's like this talk, he calls it, of exploitation, of like dependency, that for him, he uses this sort of term, it comes from these newbies, these newbies thinking about development, are coming up with these ideas, but really let's just reaffirm what we think are the core issues and take it to beyond the region and into the global level.
Dependentista's power and influence in Chile was, of course, crushed alongside the Popular Unity government with Pinochet's 1973 military coup. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Cardoso would become the leading intellectual opponent to the military regime, but not at all as a radical leftist, and not really as any sort of leftist at all. He made his way into the opposition, the principal opposition party, the Brazilian Democratic Movement, or MDB, and led a sort of thoroughly liberal opposition to authoritarianism. And then ultimately, after the transition to democracy, he served 2 terms as Brazil's rather neoliberal president in the mid-1990s. How do we make sense of Cardoso's trajectory? Because I've always found it extremely confusing.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the questions that I think this book is just not only this book, I guess, but with that I try to open with this book because and that is worth sort of like unpacking more. Well, first of all, I think that when Cardoso began his opposition to the military regime, he himself and others would characterize them as part of the left. It could be because the left was a very broad definition to anyone who opposed the military dictatorship. It could be because that was kind of the term had to be very broad in these conditions of authoritarianism. It could be that too. So first, that's one of the things that we should remember. Like, I don't know if like he necessarily like or others think of him as something other than a member of the left in the 1970s and even into the early 80s. So there's just one thing. And the other thing is that I think we should think about Cardoso as a critic of the development state since the very beginning, right? Since he began criticizing Cepalinos for their belief in the development power of the state, in the development power of the bourgeoisie, in the conceptualization of the nation as the space of the nation and the sort of the international, so the relations between nations as the space of development. He began his intellectual career that way. And when he was trying to come to terms with the military regime, he was also sort of thinking along those lines. How can this regime be how can we understand this very developmentalist regime, right? Because the Brazilian military regime was highly developmentalist. It started a few years with some sort of what we would later call monetarist ideas, but that was very short, and it clearly veered off to continue the development, what I kind of sort of started to call like Brazil's developmentalist vocation that lasts till this day, and it's kind of embedded in many of these institutions. So Cardoso's position against this regime was also the position against the developmentalist state. And in that sense, we can see some continuity with what happens in what the so-called pure neoliberal era of the 90s in which he was president.
That's fascinating because it means that dependency theory in Cardoso's case really becomes a critique of CEPAL developmentalism, not from the left, but from the right and from what would become known as sort of the neoliberal perspective in Latin America.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's why I think sometimes the terms right and left start hindering more than helping us in the understanding of the problem, because, then we have to force to answer the question of, well, when did he actually switch? When did he, like, one day he was from the left and then the next morning or something he was from the right? And I think that is not a helpful way to think about it. And so that's why sometimes perhaps those categories of left and right in this particular kind of case doesn't help us to understand what's going on, unless you kind of just say like, well, he's a traitor, which,
I'm sure many Brazilians have said that. And it goes without saying that the PT and Lula were doing something rather different at the time.
Right. And in many ways, the relationship between Cardoso and Lula since not just in the post-dictatorship era, but in the authoritarian era, was a sort of a kind of contested one as well. But yeah, some like Cardoso, but many others on the left did not necessarily support Lula in the very beginning. In fact, some of the Brazilian dependentistas did not support Lula in sort of the early stages and support other parties of the left. So there's a split, many splits and many sort of process of negotiation and coalition building that are going on at the time that kind of are eventually going to shape how the process, sort of the historical process, unfolds to what we call the neoliberalism or the neoliberal era. Yeah.
You write that after the revolutionary heyday and amid the rise of reactionary dictatorships, that many Latin American intellectuals may be a bit disillusioned, turned against dependency theory. Yet at the same time, and you referenced this earlier, dependency theory was newly ascendant elsewhere in the world, including among left-wing Latin Americanists here in the U.S. and in Europe. And also, very critically, it influenced Walter Rodney's classic, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And then also influenced the legendary Egyptian-French Marxist political economist Samir Amin. And it was Samin, alongside Gunther Frank, who in turn helped Emanuel Wallerstein and Giovanni Arrighi shape what would come to be known as world systems theory. What did world systems theorists learn from dependency theory? And what then made world systems theory something new and distinct?
That's a big question to have. But I think both of them, I think that the sort of line of influences, as any sort of line of influences, is one that is hard to trace. But Samir Amin does, in the late 60s, write about these dependentistas as saying, well, this is where innovative ways of thinking about the world economy are emerging. It's in Latin America where these innovative ways of thinking about the world economy are emerging. But you can also say that, people like him or Wallerstein, by that matter, were coming up with similar ideas from the point of view of Africa, let's say, like just as dependentistas were trying to understand the world economy, not from the point of view of sort of Europe or the United States, and was sort of traditionally the case, but from the point of view of Latin America. I think what they are trying to do, and the world that dependentistas sort of imagined had to do, borrowing that of Cepalinos of center and periphery, was sort of further complicated by the notion that Wallerstein added of the semi-periphery. So that's kind of an added one. But I think that both of them kind of are trying to think in this sort of like systemic level, and one has to remember that in a way the dependentistas were observing the world from what they call the internationalization of the internal market, like this diffusion of transnational capital that has nothing to do with the particular nation states, that has to do with the growth of multinational corporations and these divided forms of organizing both capital and labor. And Wallerstein, in a way, is sort of coming from the other end historically, I guess, the way he's approaching the emergence of the world system. So they're coming from two ends, let's say, of a historical process of the creation of sort of world system. So I think that's how they kind of, it's one way to at least think about how they come together.
You write, quote, "As a result of the endeavors of Amin, dependentistas, and many others, the third world transformed from a geopolitical to an economic category." How did that shift from this Cold War geopolitical category to an economic category, unifying oppressed nation states struggling against this neocolonialist world system? How did that shift come about, and what role did dependency theory play in bringing it about? And then also, is it a coincidence that these major third worldist economic initiatives like the new International Economic Order, just like CEPAL, took shape in the United Nations?
And that has to do with many, that's the cumulative effect of many voices. But I think CEPAL was one of the crucial ones, because the third world had to do with sort of like, it was the other in the Cold War division, right? There was the East and the West, and then the rest, let's say, and that rest was the third world. So I guess that's why I was saying, like, well, it is a geopolitical definition coming from the Cold War that then later on we started to think about as an economic definition, and by that I mean by the third world as defined by the place in the position it occupies in the global economy, and especially in the international division of labor, first as producers, but now we also sort of we can talk about that similar terms in other realms. So sort of like the distribution of labor and labor regimes, or where consumption patterns, and many others. But in the beginning, it had to do with this specialization as producers of raw materials. And I think that definition sort of stuck, right? And it had more, not just more traction, but more possibility of surviving once the Cold War ended, right? And we can keep...
And much more political juice.
Right, I guess. And it also was, at the same moment, it was that definition that was kind of underpinning initiatives like UNCTAD that we talked to before, but also the new international economic order. And many of those were, the new international economic order was kind of very much borrowing or growing out of the legacies of UNCTAD. So it is not, and I don't think it is, to go to your question about the coincidence of the United Nations. I think many scholars have talked about the extent that the UN became the vehicle and the platform, or the arena that was used by those countries in the periphery or the global south to make their claims, because I guess until that moment they institutionalized one, and so it's not coincidence that those paths were that both of these projects were UN projects. Although, having said that, it's also true that many other attempts of internationalism on the global south kind of use other means that were not the UN necessarily, right? Like we can, once kind of led by Cuba, but others also led by other countries as well that did not pass through the UN. But the ones that did pass through the UN had this CEPALino touch.
Yeah, and I mean, the UN goes from 51 members in 1945 to 126 members in 1968.
Yeah, and it keeps growing by the 70s, right? So it does become they become this force in the General Assembly and all the and in many ways there was a voice and a power that was not present in other international organizations. So that's also why it's not sort of surprising that the UN has this role, and that they use the UN, even if it's not, so many people question, I guess, the extent to which the UN has, concrete effects. But one of the concrete effects it has is one, bringing all these voices together, and thus being the possibility of speaking up on these global matters in a way that would be listened to.
Yeah, and then prior to widespread decolonization, then Latin American countries were some of the few independent nation states that were not colonial.
Right.
Colonizing nation states, though, I mean, they were led by Creole elites established by European colonization, so that's complicated, but they did occupy this kind of unique position in the international community prior to widespread decolonization.
Right. On these, and I think that had to do also with sort of the why CEPAL sort of was able to become CEPAL, I guess, has the specific position of Latin America in the world, at the political position of Latin America in the world, and as both, in a way, the periphery that is independent, but also that in many ways consider itself as part of the West, as opposed to kind of other, as opposed to Asia or even Africa, right? That many, even despite the contradictions entailed by that affirmation, many of the Latin American leaders did consider Latin America as part of the West. So that also kind of helped to kind of frame the discussions that they are, and perhaps also to limit them as well.
Where does the story you tell relate to the rise of not new now, but new then, and rather conservative theories to explain the problem of third world development, namely modernization theory, which posited this linear path of progress that would lead all nations to follow the West in their development? To what extent were dependency and world systems theorists responding to the ascendance of modernization theory in the U.S. or vice versa, or at least in some sort of conversation and conflict with one another?
Yeah, I think that is interesting, not just of Cepalinos, but many of the development thinkers that are trying to conceptualize development from places other than the Europe and the US, I guess. And it has to do with the fact that they both, and this is what Cepalinos did and Dependentistas did, claim that there are different paths to development, that there are different ways to conceptualize it, that development or that the country's development in the late 20th century or in the mid 20th century were had a different historical experience than the countries developing in the late 19th century or even in the early 19th century. So this attempt at like to kind of conceptualize historical difference that matters to the possibilities that they have to develop or not, like you mean that has policy and political and economic implications, goes along with a reification of some sort of also path of development, right? Like most of these development thinkers kind of believed that it was industrialization, which was, the path that all these other countries had taken, was the mean to achieve development. So I've always sort of, this doesn't kind of play necessarily a gigantic role in the book, but I do think that that is something that is kind of one of the, if we were talking about the development paradox in sort of the economic world, this is the paradox also of these development thinkers, that they're both trying to distance themselves, but they can't because out of the intellectual tradition, but also because this is the way that historically had been proven to translate into growth, right? Like the industrialization of all these different countries that had gone through the process in the 19th century, and that in some ways they did want to imitate, even if they didn't want to follow the same way, and even if they were advocating for a different path than those that the developing countries had transversed, the goal was sort of say similar and follow the benchmark that they had established.
When we think about economists in Chile, we in the United States on the left typically think not of the Cepalinos, but rather of the infamous neoliberal Chicago boys who played such a key role in the Pinochet dictatorship. But you write, quote, "Sponsored by the Ford Foundation, the infamous Chicago boys, who dominate our narrative of the battle of economic ideas in Latin America, struggled to unseat Cepalinos on their home turf, and were only successful after a sweeping realignment of political forces in Chile and the use of coercion and violence." How do we differently or better understand the story of the Chicago boys, one that I think a lot of listeners have some understanding of, when we see that they could only wrest authority from CEPAL through the use of a brutal military regime's repression?
Yeah, well, I think that the way I wanted to sort of approach that question was sort of kind of coming from a different end, like not necessarily trying to understand the Chicago, or rather, yeah, trying to understand the Chicago boys in relation to the power that was, or the power and influence that CEPAL kind of had among the sort of the political or policy making elite in Chile, that made it necessary for a group like the Chicago Boys to be formed and to seek influence. So I guess what the way I sort of came to this question is to think like, well, there are more than economic ideas there are not only more but more important economic ideas in Latin America than those of the Chicago Boys, even though those are the ones that occupy that space. As for the transition and the use of violence, I don't, that is something that I can think, I always think about. And of course we don't have access to a counterfactual, right? Like what would have happened, like how much, but we can sort of, and it's something that I'm sort of more interested in doing, kind of tracing the continuities and not just the break. Like we think that in like I guess in Chile there was like a fundamental break in the terms of economic ideas after the Chicago Boys and the authoritarian regime. But there are many ways in which the ideas of Cepalinos, I mean, this is something that I am starting to kind of research on, sort of lived through these kind of momentous regimes. So that's the way sort of I think about this. Like, to what extent they were definitely crushed in the moment, but that doesn't mean that many of the ideas disappeared. And in fact, some of them were resurrected and implemented during what we call the neoliberal era. So I feel like these are something more than, there are more sort of continuities, I think, than we imagine.
You write, quote, initially concerned with growth and development more than equity, for Cepalinos, the recent demands for better education and healthcare of a precarious middle class in Chile may seem as first world problems compared to the mid-century battle. Have the first and now second pink tide of Latin American governments, from Lula to Boric in Chile today, have they basically picked up where dependency theorists left off in terms of their emphasis on not only global inequality in between countries, but domestic inequality within countries? And do the Latin American left governments that have contended for power and governed since the aughts, do they still maintain, perhaps drawing on dependency theory, some of that vision for a progressive regionalism that might reshape the global economy from the periphery along the lines of what Cepalinos once imagined?
Yeah, I this is something that it's sort of like a question in my mind. So more than an answer, I don't think I have a concrete answer to this question. But I do think there are, as I was sort of saying before, there are certain initiatives that were put forward by Cepalinos in sort of the development era that come only to kind of be realized to a larger and more fuller extent in the so-called neoliberal era. And that, to me, poses sort of like a question of, well, what are the sort of legacies of these ideas, but also the extent to which are they coming from the same assumptions and presuppositions, or they are just a different outlook using similar instruments, or the instruments look the same but are actually kind of very different. So I don't know if I completely have a question to that, an answer to that question of whether they are picking up. I think their rhetoric is very different, and from the two, and they're obviously not any of them sort of building on that development era, and many or that development era. Yeah, they're not necessarily they're not nostalgic about some sort of era that was sort of better before and that we need to reinstate, but more thinking about how, I think, in some ways address some of the issues that were not kind of privileged in the past, and that had to do with equality and social development, if you will.
To what extent do you feel like the ideas put forward by Cepalinos and dependentistas, that those ideas are still relevant for the predicament of Latin America today?
That's a big question. I think in some ways they are, but in some ways I think we are also, as I was trying to say before, like, I think dependentistas were sort of right in the way that the limits that the Cepalino ideas had in terms of the nation state or the bourgeoisie, and how we need to talk about different like other categories than those two to kind of understand Latin America today. But I think some of the problems with regards to the position of Latin America in the world economy are very much there. I mean, some of the countries have managed to realize many things that Palino sort of imagined, in terms of, like, more or less, although this has changed very recently, more or less achieve some sort of monetary stability that, the past 2 years have changed everything, I guess. But they had managed to do something like that. But a lot of the questions of and therefore sort of solve some of the short-term problems of created by that position that Latin America plays in the sort of world economy. But the long-term problems are still there, I think, like a sort of this dependence on on the production of agricultural goods, even though many of them are much more diversified than they used to be in the mid-century. So I think kind of to solve many policy problems, maybe we need to kind of rethink some of these categories. But in the broad sense, they're useful categories for historical and long-term and development analysis. And sort of, I'm just thinking about your pink tide question, and I don't like, and it's because a lot of not all of them, but many of these leaders had some populist vein, like if you think of, or were very much can be described along those lines. Like if you think of Chavez, for instance, I don't think that was necessarily like for many of the Cepalinos, like even like Prebisch or Furtado, that was what was kind of more dangerous, or that was they were less identified with in terms of their political alignment. So I don't know if like they would be here today, would they align with some figures like them? Probably not.
It's interesting to try to think through to what extent Latin America's position in the world economy has both changed and stayed the same, because on the one hand, they're countries like Mexico and Brazil, which had relatively successful forms of industrial substitution, import substitution, industrialization, have experienced forms of deindustrialization and in recent decades. Whereas, while at the same time, like you mentioned, although some countries' primary commodity exports have diversified to an extent, a lot of their economy is still based on the export of primary goods, even as more of those goods go not just to the United States and Europe, but to China. The basic structure of the world system has stayed in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of and that's why it's harder to. I think in many ways, the idea of center periphery, that notion sort of helps to think about those, but it doesn't map as neatly, I guess, as it was in the mid-century, and therefore we sort of have to adapt how we think of those terms. I think they're useful because as I guess, going back to kind of one of the beginning questions, like sometimes we think of center periphery as just meaning as another word for saying imperial or colonial, and I think the value in some of these categories was that they were not thinking of these terms, but how much kind of the system sort of worked, economic system worked, as opposed to how the political relations between these countries. And so in that sense, some of that helps to think about Latin America today. But it is, I think, the position of these countries has, as you were saying, and as I sort of talk about it in the epilogue, has changed in some ways that would surprise Cepalinos both positively and negatively. As I was saying, I think the vulnerability that Cepalinos saw of these countries to their position in the global economy has not been eliminated, but has lessened due to a number of structures, like as you were saying, like the increasing the number of buyers of the products, but also in the number of products that they're selling, and because in many ways they did undergo industrialization and they did create some other important sources of growth.
Well, Margarita Fajardo, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to all the ones who made it through this point.
Margarita Fajardo is a historian at Sarah Lawrence College and the author of The World That Latin America Created, the United States Economic Commission for Latin America in the Development Era. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the discovery of gold and silver in the America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis and recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel and Mariel Solomon. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. And we have a new, really good-looking website. Check it out. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio and find us wherever you get podcasts. And subscribe. If it's on iTunes, also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. What really does that, though, is you telling your friends to check out the podcast. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.